So, returning to what I was saying, move on to next point here. You see the kind of archetypal hippie bus from the 1960s. Dissidence and rebellion within American society were hardly new things. Now, suffice to say, there have been dissidence and rebellion that had taken numerous forms prior to this era. But part of what defined the counterculture movement was the way it enveloped young, white, middle-class Americans, because previously, when we talk about dissidence and rebellion, we often think of particular pressure points or organizations, labor groups and organizations, but also something that would have been organized through, say, Marxist ideology. So communists within American society in the 1930s and the 1940s. And as I said previously, in American society, you'd often see persecuted minorities like Jewish people and African Americans in those groups. But this was a kind of an expansion of the idea of dissidence and rebellion, encompassing more of the population, and in particular, precisely the young people who've been born in the baby boom generation. So all the people who have been born in the immediate post-war period, well, they were often the hippies of the 1960s because they were right at that age. In fact, you could say in general that this was an unleashing of the energy of youth at this time, because you had, proportionally speaking, a lot of young people coming of age simultaneously, and it was that kind of youthful idealism, rebellion, and dissidence which kind of came to the fore of American culture during the 60s. There are a lot of different factors to think about here, just a couple to consider. The role of television and magazines worth considering, because you had the eruption of a lot of different news sources, underground magazines, comics, and a variety of different sources in between, but also television as well. The easy availability of television allowed for the spread of information and ideas much more quickly than in the past, because one thing that TV does, similar to the internet today, it provides a steady, almost unending stream of information for people, and there was a kind of diversification of perspectives that happened over time. It's similar in a way to the advent of the printing press, which I mentioned last semester, takes us all the way back to the 1400s, but the same idea. When you have this mechanism which makes print media, booklets, pamphlets, writings more available, well, thus you have a more rapid circulation of ideas, which was of central importance in another dissident, rebellious movement, the Reformation, back in the 1500s. Well, similar dynamic in the 60s. The circulation of ideas can foster counter perspectives, counterpoint views, and indeed subversion. Mentioned the demographic changes. Well, basically I already touched upon that. This kind of emergence of a younger society, people coming of age, and a prosperity as well. That's something that should also be taken into account, because you not only had a lot of younger people at this time, but you had young people who were living better than their parents or grandparents had done. This wasn't quite the same era as when young people had been sent off to fight in World War II, or had endured the Depression in the 1930s, or even in the 1920s. I mean, prosperity in previous periods was that kind of rare bird, even in American society. I mean, most people lived in quite difficult circumstances, but you just had a lot more in the way of wealth and affluence. So what does that entail for people? Well, among other things, it means you have a lot more people attending university than previously. So you have the kind of centralization of youth, the campus culture, which becomes bigger at this time, which is more kind of a free exchange for ideas and principles, but also the availability of various things, the kind of disposable income, which gives people access to what? Things like records, for instance, so they can sample all sorts of different music forms, things like recreational drugs, which of course became such a big thing during the 1960s. Those those kinds of just opportunities for what we might call idle relaxation, which were not readily available in previous generations, well, those moments of idle relaxation can indeed foster and cultivate something else, a different kind of viewpoint or a different kind of perspective on the world, and that seems to have been what was happening more during the 1960s. Those are just a couple of different factors we can point to here. Another thing to mention about the counterculture is the kind of the flexibility of capitalism. If previous movements of rebellion and dissidence had perhaps been interested in the true revolutionary overthrow of American society, of indeed perhaps instituting a socialism in U.S. culture, it doesn't really seem as though the counterculture movement actually tended in that direction. I mean, I'm sure some hippies thought in that way, but most of them seem to be working with the idea of ameliorating American society, basically meaning improving it slowly over time. And the capitalist system itself, the material paradigm that serves as this kind of overarching framework, that seemed to chug along just fine in many respects, notwithstanding a variety of different forms of rebellion and opposition. In fact, you could almost say that capitalism was kind of caught up with the counterculture movement because there's all sorts of different consumer products that became associated with this movement. The availability, again, of recreational drugs, of blue jeans, of tie-dye shirts, of contraceptives, of records. All these different things are for sale and available at this time. And so that perhaps does something to explain the kind of reactionary force that settles into American society as the counterculture generation grows older. Case in point, there's Bob Dylan, a representative of the counterculture movement. In the 90s, his song, The Times They Are Changing, which is a famous anthem of the kind of hippie era, was used in a Bank of Montreal advertising campaign, which a lot of people were really upset about because the idea of his song, which is about a particular era of rebellion in American society, being used as a jingle for a bank of all things. I mean, that struck them as being a very kind of jarring sort of joining of oppositional forces. Well, they might not be entirely oppositional when you get down to it, the kind of movement here between the existing capitalist system and the counterculture movement such as it was. Make no mistake, though, there was indeed vehement opposition just on the level of ideas, values, and principles. The kind of conformist side of American society had its own perspective, which certainly opposed anything to do with hippies, even things that were a part of improving the conditions of individual people, such as feminism, civil rights, gay rights, other aspects of American society that we're going to look at. And then civil rights, which you'd have to say was the biggest thing that emerged during this period. You see some of the subjects to consider. And of course, this is not by any means exhaustive, but just a couple of snapshots that we're going to look at here. Ongoing civil rights, the Harlem Renaissance, which was earlier, see 1919 to 1929, but we're thinking about here the Montgomery bus boycott, which happened in 55 and 56, and different versions of civil rights. Say civil rights, and when people say the civil rights era, they are typically thinking about this post-war period in the 1950s and 60s, and in particular, the concerted opposition to the Jim Crow laws, if you wanted to kind of boil it down to one particular thing. These were the laws of institutional segregation that existed in the southern United States. So laws that were on the books which explicitly segregated, divided white Americans from black Americans. And this was a kind of a legacy, not just of slavery, but also the Reconstruction era in the American South, which I mentioned in a previous class, the forces of segregation, which basically instituted this racial division in the southern U.S. There you see a 1905 political cartoon depicting the realities of the separate but equal Jim Crow laws. The reason that the Jim Crow laws were allowed to stand in the constitutional sense, because clearly they're violating the constitutional law, but the reason they were allowed to stand was the notion that it is okay to have segregation as long as the conditions and standards are equal on both sides. So if white Americans and African Americans are living in roughly equal conditions, then it is okay to have segregation. But the reality was the conditions rarely were actually equal. When you're talking about African American facilities, the educational system, institutions, whatever it might be, were chronically underfunded within the state. So it never was a reality of separate but equal. It was always separate and unequal. You think about the kind of legacy of this, and there you see one of the kind of icons of American culture, a poster for the 1915 film "The Birth of a Nation," which is in part a glorification of white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan. It was actually instrumental in provoking a rise in Klan membership during the 1920s, which I mentioned previously. This, you would have to say, was in many respects the first full-length feature film in American history. It runs at something like 3 hours long. It's a silent film, so you don't actually have any kind of sound effects or talking. So it's shot in the classic form of the silent movie, and it's this kind of epic drama about the Civil War culture in the United States, but also about the reinstitution of racial divisions and the Klan at this time. And how fitting, how appropriate in a way that America becomes this country that's famous for the cinema. You have to think about kind of one art form that really defines the American ethos. So it would probably have to be film, with Hollywood being the kind of center of the culture. Well, how fitting that the first version of this, the first feature full-length film, is precisely a depiction of the realities of American society, but a glorification, as I say, of white supremacy and the Klan. You see a painting from Aaron Douglas's Aspects of Negro Life, this giving a sense of living in the southern states, and this referring to a migration to city centers in the north. These are just two paintings from an entire series of representations. There are many different strands of civil rights, so different ways of thinking about it. I would say one major thread involves the demand that America produce a legitimately concrete version of its democratic ideals. And I should point out that that's not the only version, but one of the kind of longest standing versions of civil rights. If America is to set itself up as this democratic society, the home of a democracy, as is enshrined in the Constitution and as is promoted by many of the, quote, founding fathers of the American state, well, if it actually takes that stance, then it must live up to those ideals in some legitimate way. It cannot be the case that the country just carries the banner of democracy as a kind of brand name, and yet does not promulgate that experience in any real way for the people who live in the country. Remember what I said previously about the idea of creative democracy, which probably one of the most famous philosophers in American history, John Dewey, speaks about, but also 19th century black women feminists and philosophers also speak about that idea. Creative democracy, the notion that democracy is an experience that you have on a day-to-day basis, not just something that exists in this abstract form in a government building or a constitutional document that nobody ever reads in full. Rather, it's the kind of thing that you experience day to day where you're aware you're actually living in a real democracy, not just a country that pretends as though it is one. So the real experience of democracy, I think that would have to be one of the kind of major threads through civil rights. I mentioned the civil rights movement. When you speak about the civil rights era, well, it's heavily associated with the 50s, the 60s, and the opposition to the Jim Crow laws in the South. But we can speak about it in a much broader sense than that. Someone could say, well, when did civil rights begin in America? Well, if we're talking about civil rights in terms of a push towards equality, the treatment of people on equal terms and not just on the basis of their ethnicity or the color of their skin. Well, that has been going on since the beginning of American society. That has been going on since well before America was even a country. That struggle for equality, that struggle for justice is woven into the very foundations of American culture. And so we could talk about the subject across any given period in American history. As far as developments in the 20th century, well, I mentioned this previously. At the beginning of the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of African Americans lived in the rural South, which was indeed the site of the Jim Crow laws where institutionalized segregation existed. That changed in the interwar period, 1918 to 1939, when approximately 1.5 million African Americans fled the South, moving to cities such as New York, Chicago, and Detroit. So there was much more in this kind of push towards urbanization and people, all sorts of different groups of people occupying city centers. And with that, you had the emergence of a new cultural identity that appears in the interwar period. So here we are in the year 1919, the emergence of the Harlem Renaissance. And I'm going to mention this because it forms a kind of thread in the different links we're looking at here. There you see a depiction of the Harlem Renaissance, which, as I say, is generally dated between 1919 and 1929. It's associated with Harlem, although there were parallel movements that existed in other cities like Detroit, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. And it's generally thought to be this upsurge of African-American culture and artistic expression and political activism that occurred at this time. Although Renaissance is a little bit of the wrong word, although that's its name, because Renaissance implies a kind of rebirth, which suggests, I would say, that African-American culture had been kind of underground previously, which wasn't the case. It just took a different form at this time. There are all sorts of different ways we can think about the Harlem Renaissance in terms of its literature, its art, its philosophy, its music. All of these things were important at the time. But one thing I want to focus on, because it pertains to what I mentioned before, is the image production of a new sense of African-American identity within the states. Remember what I said previously about the stereotypical racialized and racist constructions of African-American identity in, say, the 1800s. Very much caught up with the plantation culture, especially the figure of the mammy, for instance, which I mentioned previously. So that is the woman who works on a plantation, and she's this kind of robust, God-fearing individual who takes care of white children and loves them as their own, and she kind of accepts her subordinate position. And most of the mainstream caricatures and constructions of African-American identity were indeed wedded to the Southern plantation. And there was this kind of general entire nexus of different cultural productions. Well, one thing that people of the Harlem Renaissance were interested in doing was presenting a kind of alternative image, which would not be about the rural South, would not be about plantations, but would rather be about northern urban centers. And so the direction in this sense was much more towards an ideal of the urbanite, the cosmopolite, the educated, sophisticated person. Even we might say a little bit the bourgeois person. So someone who wears fancier clothing or obtains higher education, as we're seeing presented in these images, as a kind of alternative version of the Black American citizen at this time, which was not just a kind of a promotion to the culture, but increasingly a reality as well. So the Harlem Renaissance was giving us a much different version of African American culture than had been present previously. There you see two of the journals of the Harlem Renaissance: The Crisis, which was founded in 1910, and Opportunity, founded in 1923. You see some of the figureheads of the Harlem Renaissance, but this also touches upon the issue of diversity, because here you see people who were, in some ways, the kinds of gatekeepers of this movement, leading figures in the New Negro movement. New Negro basically refers to these kinds of images, showing a kind of different version of the African American. The language of the 1920s, of course. Jesse Fawcett, an author, Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois, philosophers, leading intellectual figures, but they were kind of just one version of the Harlem Renaissance, people who were basically self-styled members of the talented 10th, so the upper echelons of African American society, most educated, the ones who had also the best perspective, according to them, on what was going on in society. But there are all sorts of different kind of threads and strands within the Harlem Renaissance, including those who celebrated the plantation culture or the legacy of the plantation culture. So it wasn't just one-sided, but there are lots of different diversity within the Harlem Renaissance at this time. This, I would say, takes us into the civil rights era, because we talk about the civil rights. Too often, there is the tendency to imagine that there was just one unidimensional viewpoint at this time, as though everyone had basically agreed to the same perspective and the same mode of resistance. Well, not true. There are a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different competing values and positions that existed at this time. Nor is it the case that the civil rights movement just kind of sprung up out of nowhere in the 50s and 60s. If you had the Harlem Renaissance, which was during the 1920s, well, you had a lot of other things that happened in the intervening years, including this very significant event as well. Jackie Robinson breaking baseball's color barrier in the year 1947. When he was signed, not to play for Montreal, that was his minor league team, but to play for Brooklyn. So a very significant event there, because Major League Baseball previously had been segregated, but this was a moment where Jackie Robinson joined the major leagues. And then one of the most significant events of the civil rights era, the Montgomery bus boycott, which takes us to 1955 and 56. You see Rosa Parks as the central figure in the Montgomery bus boycott, and if we were to talk about a concerted resistance to the Jim Crow laws of segregation, well, this is one place to begin. Buses, like schools, washrooms, waiting rooms, restaurants, and numerous other places and facilities, were segregated under the Jim Crow laws in the South. So there you see an instance of institutional segregation aboard a bus, and this was a system of segregation and division that extended across all facets of the American South. And as I say, this was legally institutionalized and codified. In the North, you tended to see de facto segregation, so segregation that is accepted but not necessarily legally binding. Many cases, not all cases, where in the South it was actually institutionalized and a part of the legal system at the time. So Rosa Parks famously was someone who was sitting in a section reserved for white passengers and refused to give up her seat, and was subsequently arrested for disobeying the laws, and subsequently turned this into a kind of rallying cry, or a kind of drawing card for this larger campaign of resistance and rebellion. Rosa Parks was someone who was involved with the NAACP at this time, so she was very accustomed to acts of dissidence against the segregationist laws that existed at this time. But the simple act was basically just refusing to move to the segregated section of the bus. Now you see the Montgomery City Lines bus that was the site of Parks's arrest in December of 1955. I say the arrest brought together old systems of discrimination and new modes of transportation. And that's an important point for understanding this context, because here we are in the post-war era, and urbanization has come to the American South, because for a long time the American South was more this kind of rural agrarian society. But the flood of urbanization, the growth of city centers, was something that had been ongoing in American society and was increasingly the norm when we get into the 50s and the 60s. And so you have new modes of transportation. The bus becomes precisely that image, as well as that implement of the commuter culture, of having to travel around a city center. When you have lots of roads and lots of space, if you want to get to your place of work, well, often people are not living in the same places that they work, so they have to find a way to get there. So the bus is kind of that part of modern culture, modern society. But it includes within it the old systems of discrimination. That's basically what we see with the Jim Crow laws persisting up until this time. It's an attempt to kind of regulate the new modes of transportation, the new technology, the new infrastructure, to keep the old systems in place, including the segregation of black and white Americans in the South. So it's a kind of uneven melding of the new and the old. At the same time, also highlighting both inequalities and close proximities of black and white citizens in the South and American cities generally, because the bus also, as a kind of institutional implement mode of transportation, it was predominantly African Americans in a city like Montgomery who would take the bus. Why? Because they can't afford to own cars. So it's pointing out this kind of disjunction within the modes of transportation. Also, the other reason why a lot of African Americans would take the bus is, again, because they don't live in the same places where they work. They would live in segregated neighborhoods, but a lot of time they would be working in affluent white neighborhoods. That would be the place where they have to travel to, commute to on a regular basis. But their place of work is not the same place where they live. So immediately it kind of just brings together the realities of American society at the time. And also the close proximities of black and white citizens in the South, which had always been a reality. There was never this idea that African Americans and white Americans in the South had no contact with each other. No, they were in close proximity to each other at all times. I mean, you take any given household, there would certainly be this intermingling of black and white people within the household. This takes us all the way back even to the days of slavery and the plantation culture, with it trying to promote itself as this kind of familial structure. So, the figure of the mammy, for instance, it's not as though she's barred from having any contact with the white people she works for. No, I mean, she's basically raising their children in many cases. So that's very close, intimate proximity. But the key point there is close proximities which were founded on this idea of knowing one another, or having this kind of communal interconnectivity, or even this sort of false family dynamic, which was the case in the plantation society under slavery. The risk of the bus as a public mode of transportation is you have a lot of people in close proximity and they don't know each other. So that's where the kind of threat comes in, right? That's the idea of why we have to keep people segregated in this public space. In private spaces, there's a lot of kind of crossover and cross contact. In public spaces, that's where you have this suspicion of the other, of other people. So this kind of idea of, oh no, black people have to be over here, white people have to be over here, to prevent this kind of exchange between people who are unfamiliar to each other. So I think that's part of the reason why this became such a big kind of moment in the civil rights movement, not just because it was the unjust arrest of Rosa Parks. And by the way, she was not the first one. There were many other people who were arrested previously for defying or breaking the Jim Crow laws. It caught on with Rosa Parks in particular due to her standing with the NAACP. So she knew a lot of people involved in the movement, but many other people, just regular people, anonymous people, have been arrested for breaking these laws previously. But it also kind of knit together a lot of different aspects of American society at the time. Rosa Parks becomes this kind of leading figure in this movement, and so too Martin Luther King Jr. The Montgomery bus boycott is really where he rises to prominence as a leader of this moment of resistance. But I would say, in retrospect, it wasn't really about the individual leaders so much as it was about this a grassroots mobilization. And I think that's part of the reason why the boycott becomes such a successful mode of resistance, because it just reaches the individual person, the common person on the street. Boycott, demand for a boycott goes out and says, well, the bus services are discriminating against African Americans, so call out to African Americans in Montgomery, don't take the bus anymore. Just refuse to take the bus. And that's exactly what people did for a long time, for a year, essentially. A mode of resistance and, you could say, almost passive resistance, with people finding alternative ways of getting places in the city. Use whatever means are available. Carpool if you have to, ride bikes if you have to, walk if you have to, but whatever you do, don't get onto the bus. Well, what happens? Well, these people are the main clientele for the bus service. They make up the majority of people who ride on the bus. So what happens? Well, the bus service starts losing all the money that they're making, because nobody's actually taking the bus anymore. So it just spins things around and shines a light on the way that a company like the Montgomery City Lines is complicit in the Jim Crow laws, is complicit in segregation and discrimination. And basically people are saying, if you want to be complicit in these laws, then you're not going to have any business anymore. So the boycott continues, as I say, for a year or more, and that forces change. The desegregation of the bus line, as I say, watershed moment in the civil rights movement. Not something that was just readily accepted in the American South or other places as well. There had been laws striking down segregationist practices, famous ruling about the American educational system, Brown versus the Board of Education in, I think that was 1954 or 55. That was basically a case which ruled that segregated school systems in the United States were unconstitutional. So it was not allowed to segregate school systems on racial lines. But that did not mean that there was instantaneous integration of the American school systems, because note the date there, 1963. So we're talking almost 10 years after the law has been declared unconstitutional, 10 years after the fact that the American government basically says it's wrong for you to do this, you can't do this anymore. Well, there had to be this kind of push, this movement towards the forceful integration of the schooling system due to resistance that reaches the level of the Alabama governor at the time. There you see George Wallace, governor of Alabama, standing in front of the doorway to the University of Alabama. Why is he doing that? Because he's trying to block African American students from registering at the university. There were 2 students who were going to register, and he insisted on standing there before being forced to stand down because he was violating federal law. So it wasn't as though this kind of practice of integration was accepted just free-handedly all at once. It was a continuous movement between changing the laws, resistance, changing laws further resistance, which continued, I would say, continues up until this day. So say Martin Luther King Jr. gained recognition during the Montgomery bus boycotts, and in some respects, the March on Washington of 1963, where there were hundreds of thousands of people participating, became a centerpiece for the entire movement, in part due to King's I Have a Dream speech, which you can listen to. You can find it on YouTube, for instance. Probably one of the most famous speeches in American history. However, this kind of, the March on Washington represented just one variation of civil rights. I think the thing with this is, in retrospect, it's kind of taken the form of the nexus or the locus of the civil rights movement, when it was in reality one event within a whole slew of other events that occurred at the time. And I would say that, at least in American mainstream culture, the March on Washington has become the kind of event that seems to uphold the ideals of American society at large. Here you really have the sense of American society living up to the democratic ideals, but the democratic ideals that are specifically enshrined in the Constitution or promoted by someone like Abraham Lincoln. And in that way, you could see the March on Washington as being the sort of mainstream, even the kind of institutionalized version of the civil rights. Not to say it wasn't significant, it certainly was, but there was this kind of uneasy alliance that was formed at the time with people like Martin Luther King and the powers to be, such as President Lyndon Johnson. For instance, during the speeches at the March on Washington, there was the demand that the speeches be sanitized to an extent, to remove references to, say, quote, the masses or, quote, revolution. Why? Well, because there's just too much risk of backlash from labor unions, from churches, from certain white liberals. There are a lot of people who support the civil rights movement, but they're not going to want to be reminded of the kinds of links to the idea of revolution or Marxism or the overthrow of the U.S. government. There's the idea that, at least from the kind of official perspective, well, we don't want to go down that road. Just focus instead on the idea that civil rights are going to kind of force America to live up to its ideals, that are going to make America become the kind of society it can be, as opposed to just toppling the American state, which is what would perhaps be suggestive if people start talking about revolution. So, suffice to say, not all the people who participated in civil rights would have been fans of the March on Washington, or, for that matter, Martin Luther King Jr. Here you see an alternative perspective offered by Malcolm X, who's one of a number of individuals who criticized, quote, the establishment wing of the civil rights movement, and he referred to the March on Washington as the farce on Washington, because he was offering a perspective that wasn't really about forcing white America to live up to its ideals, but rather a counterpoint perspective altogether, focused on Black America and its place not only just within this society, but in the future as well. The Black Power movement was this other strand of the civil rights movement, which seemed to move in a kind of counterpoint direction. But this was prominent as well and found all sorts of different moments of expression. There are all sorts of different forms of rebellion and dissidence that can emerge at this time. You can have resistance in the form of boycotting a bus service. You can have a march on the capital city. Well, how about this as another form of resistance? African American athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos giving Black Power salutes on the podium during the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. So athletes who represent this country, the United States, and they win medals for America, but at the same time, they express their perspective on the troubles with American society and their place within American culture, their perspective on how America treats them and other African Americans. So another form of resistance or rebellion, which drew a kind of fierce, vitriolic backlash at the time, as these acts often do when they're connected to sports. Think about kneeling during the national anthem as well. The kind of incredible backlash and controversy that has inspired in recent years in professional American football. They have another act that draws a visibility to inequality and injustice. Well, this too, part of a long-standing tradition in America. Okay, so I think, yeah, we're out of time. So we'll finish up with the last of this next time, and then move on to the next section. So enjoy the rest of the week.